The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today we meet to consider H.R. 3033, the Research Excellence and Advancements for Dyslexia Act, or READ Act, and H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3033, the Research Excellence and Advancements for Dyslexia Act, or READ Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3033, a bill to require the President's annual budget request to Congress each year.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3033, the Research Excellence and Advancements for Dyslexia Act, will help millions of Americans who struggle with dyslexia. It is fitting that we consider this bill now, since October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. The READ Act requires the National Science Foundation's budget to include a specific line item in the Research and Disabilities Education Program. And the bill requires the NSF to invest at least $5 million annually for merit-reviewed, competitively awarded dyslexia research projects. It uses funds already appropriated for the NSF Research and Related Activities account or the Education and Human Resources Directorate for these projects. Dyslexia affects an estimated 8.5 million school children and 1 in 6 Americans in some form. It causes these individuals to struggle with reading, though they often have normal or above average intelligence. There is no proven correlation between dyslexia and intelligence. Despite the prevalence of dyslexia, many Americans remain undiagnosed, untreated, and silently struggle at school or work. Too many children undiagnosed with dyslexia have difficulties in the classroom and sometimes drop out of school and face uncertain futures. In a hearing last year on the science of dyslexia, one of the best attended hearings of the committee, experts testified how research in the area of neuroscience has led to practical ways of diagnosing and dealing with dyslexia and why more research was necessary. At last week's hearing on the READ Act, our witnesses provided valuable insights and information, which are reflected in a few important changes incorporated in the manager's amendment I will offer shortly. Dr. Rachel Robillard from Austin, Texas, described why dyslexia is different from other learning disabilities. She pointed out that dyslexia doesn't correlate with intelligence and that those with dyslexia often have academic strengths in other areas that tie to STEM education, which is an important part of the NSF's mission. Dr. Robillard said in part, quote, "Dyslexia is not a disorder that can be compartmentalized. It is not just a deficit, but carries with it inherent strengths that have been recognized for decades. These might include other areas of academic strength, creative ways of thinking, more acute perceptual reasoning, and many other traits. When dyslexia goes unidentified and undiagnosed, these strengths are often suppressed," end quote. More research focused on practical application is the best way to help develop the potential of students. Who knows, one might become the next Albert Einstein, who himself had dyslexia. This research includes greater awareness of how to identify students with dyslexia, better curricula, more resources in the hands of parents, teachers, and students, and the development of proven implementation and scaling models for effective interventions. If you can't read, it's hard to achieve. If we change the way we approach dyslexia, we can turn this disability into an opportunity for a brighter and more productive future for millions of Americans. The READ Act is a step in the right direction to help those with dyslexia. The bill, sponsored by an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, ensures that our children will have the means to succeed. Nothing could be more important. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The National Science Foundation funds research across the fields of science and engineering. It is also one of our nation's most important funders of education research. The first bill we are considering today, H.R. 3033, the Research Excellence and Advancements for Dyslexia, or READ Act, addresses a specific and important issue facing education today, dyslexia. H.R. 3033 would require NSF to spend at least $5 million per year in support of research on dyslexia and would require NSF to maintain a separate budget line for the Research and Disabilities Education Program. Through its support for fields as diverse as behavioral and social science, neuroscience, and learning science, NSF has made important contributions to knowledge about and interventions for dyslexia and other learning disorders. H.R. 3033 would ensure that NSF continues to fund important research in these areas. The manager's amendment that will be considered shortly reflects the testimony we heard in a hearing on this bill last week. I'm pleased that we heeded the advice of the experts. My colleague from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, will also be offering an amendment to address funding. I will support her amendment. I also support the underlying bill. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and thank you for your support. We will now proceed with amendments in the order listed on the roster, and the first and only amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3033, offered by Mr. Smith of Texas. Page 2, lines 1 through 3. Strike paragraph 1 and redesignate.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'll recognize myself to explain the amendment. The manager's amendment makes some minor changes to the bill. These changes are in response to suggestions from both majority and minority members of the committee and expert witnesses who testified on the READ Act last week. The amendment strikes finding 1. It also adds language that authorizes the NSF to support research on, quote, implementation and scaling of successful models of dyslexia intervention, end quote. This will ensure that the best research and best practices for intervention actually help those in the classrooms and their parents. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you and your staff for working with me and my staff on making several important changes and clarifications to the underlying bill. At our hearing last week, the witnesses made a number of important points, including the need to support research on implementing and scaling up educational interventions. They discussed how an intervention may work in a laboratory setting, but that doesn't mean it will work in a school setting. I'm happy to see that the chairman has included language that addresses their concerns in the manager's amendment. Additionally, I want to thank the chairman for making other important and clarifying changes to the bill. I support the manager's amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Additionally, after these changes have been adopted, I'd like to co-sponsor the bill. I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and appreciate your co-sponsorship if the amendment passes. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on the manager's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We do have one more amendment, and the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized to offer that amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the
And
desk.
the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3033, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland and Mr. Takano of California. Page 3, lines 1 through 18.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this issue in front of our committee. The several hearings that we've held, a lot of information that we've gathered, and I think it's reflected in the bill. The bill states that the National Science Foundation should support at least $5 million on research on the science of dyslexia. That research would include research on the early identification of children and students with dyslexia, professional development, educational tools, and research on implementing successful models of dyslexia interventions. As a co-sponsor of the bill, I support the bill, and I think these research areas are extremely important. Currently, the bill states that the National Science Foundation should fund the research on the science of dyslexia with existing funds. My amendment is, quite frankly, a simple one. Instead of saying that NSF should use existing funds to support this important priority, I would authorize, and we are an authorizing committee, $5 million in new funding to support this research. And I would, of course, leave it to the appropriators to figure out at what level it should be. We should not create a situation where the National Science Foundation has to choose between equally important research areas because of financial constraints that we put on them in authorizing legislation. The research on the science of dyslexia, as I've said, is very important. I think in this committee, many of us, including myself, have shared our own experiences with these type of learning issues for our young people. The National Science Foundation should be funding this research, but let's give them the resources that they need to do it and to do it well and to reflect all of the concerns that have been brought by parents and educators and researchers to this committee. My amendment would do exactly that. It would provide the necessary authorized level of funding that's needed to get the job done. And I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, to support the underlying bill for its critical needs. I thank the gentleman from Texas, our chairman, for bringing this issue in front of us. And I would urge, again, my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I know this is a joint amendment, so would the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, like to be recognized?
Yes, Mr.
And
Chairman.
the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, first, I want to thank you for your commitment to this issue and your work to spread awareness and visibility about dyslexia. Truly, I believe this could be a true bipartisan effort in Congress. I spent more than 20 years as a high school teacher and as an elected official working to improve higher education in my community. I understand intimately the challenges of teaching students with dyslexia, and addressing this challenge requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, which is why I applaud the purpose of this legislation. According to the Mayo Clinic, dyslexia is a learning disorder characterized by difficulty reading due to problems identifying speech sounds and learning how they relate to letters and words. This learning disability impacts nearly 10% of the U.S. population, more if we accept the statistics presented by the panel that appeared before the hearing of this committee. I know from my time as a teacher that dyslexia is hard to recognize, and it wasn't until I completed a literacy training that I was able to help my students cope with this disability, much less, even with trying to identify them. A lot of my students were English learners. They were English as second language learners, and it was especially hard for them. In last week's hearing on H.R. 3033, I was struck by the testimony of Dr. Paula Talal, professor from the University of California, San Diego, who said that this legislation has the potential to construct a more effective bi-directional highway to facilitate communication between research scientists and educators. She noted that there is a significant amount of data to define dyslexia, identify its symptoms, and where in the brain evidence-based interventions can work to turn a struggling student into a successful reader. However, there is a gap between what we know about dyslexia and how that knowledge is put into practice to help students. She said that we need to provide educators with the tools and technologies proven to work, especially those based on neuroplasticity research, and I could not agree more. As I mentioned earlier, we do know what works. We just need to get those tools in the hands of teachers. This amendment would simply authorize an additional $5 million for the National Science Foundation instead of using funds from the Research and Related Activities account and the Education and Human Resources Directorate account. This would allow the NSF to continue to do this important research without taking money away from other accounts. I want to thank the committee for their important work on this issue, impacting so many American students, and I urge my colleagues to provide additional funding for this research by supporting this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. I'm going to recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, though. Let me say that I absolutely concede that the amendment is with the best of intentions and, in fact, is very supportive of the direction that we're trying to go. The National Science Foundation's Research and Related Activities account and Education and Human Resources account receive a combined $6.8 billion a year to spend on research and education activities. This bill asks that within that amount, the NSF find a modest $5 million a year to invest in dyslexia research. That is 0.07% of the research budget, or only 0.07%. It seems reasonable that the NSF can find that amount within their current budget to spend on a learning disability that affects over 8 million school children, many of whom have special talents that can enable them to do extraordinary things. The READ Act will improve the lives of millions of American children and their families. At the same time, the bill is fiscally responsible and will not add to the federal deficit by increasing overall spending. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, but of course support the underlying bill. Is there any further discussion? The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word. I strongly support this amendment offered by the gentle lady from Maryland and the gentleman from California. The underlying bill mandates that NSF fund at least $5 million in dyslexia research, but does not provide them with an actual authorization to do that. Essentially, this bill gives NSF an unfunded mandate and could risk other important priorities. Research on the science of dyslexia is important, and because of that, we should provide NSF with the necessary resources to fund it. As I've said before, I'm concerned that we continue to give our agencies, including NSF, more priorities without providing them with the necessary resources to accomplish those priorities. By doing that, we're setting up our agencies to fail instead of putting them on the path of success. And this really is not right. Ms. Edwards and Mr. Takano's amendment would provide NSF with the necessary resources to fund this new priority. I strongly support the amendment and urge my colleagues to do so as well. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Edwards and Mr. Takano. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentlewoman from Virginia has asked to be recognized, and so she is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Coming from a family of educators, I understand the difficulty dyslexia can have on children and adults. Many gifted people, especially in STEM fields, suffer from it. So I appreciated the opportunity to participate in the recent hearing held by the committee in which witnesses identified the need for better translation of research results into practical applications, early identification of children with dyslexia, and I thought that research was particularly exciting because if we can catch this at a very early age, really profoundly, make a difference throughout their lives, and more professional development for teachers and parents to identify the issues there. So as a co-sponsor of this legislation and a member of the House Dyslexia Caucus, I appreciate the opportunity to support this legislation, and I thank the chairman for bringing this to all of our attention.
Thank you, Ms. Comstock. If there are no further amendments and a reporting quorum being present as it is, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3033 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3033 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 3033 is already reported to the House, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes, and without objection, so ordered. I also have 3 letters without objection I'd like to put in the record, and they are from Learning Disabilities Association of America, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates for Special Education Rights, a letter from Sally Shaywitz, the co-director of the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. Also, I'd like to thank all the members who are here. This is a really great turnout, and I appreciate members coming to this markup today, particularly to consider these 2 bills. We will now go to the next bill, and pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3293, to provide for greater accountability in federal funding for scientific research to promote the progress of science in the United States that serves the national interest. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act, is a bipartisan bill that ensures the grant process at the National Science Foundation is transparent and accountable to the American public who actually fund the research. America's future economic growth and national security depend on innovation. Public and private investments in research and development fuel the economy, create jobs, and lead to new technologies that benefit Americans' daily lives. But to remain a world leader, we must ensure that our investments fund the highest quality basic research in science that serves our national interest. Unfortunately, in recent years, the federal government has awarded too many grants that few Americans would consider to be in the national interest. I'm going to omit this list here just to show appreciation for no amendments to this bill, and I hope a voice vote at the end. So that will save some time. When the National Science Foundation funds such projects, there is less money to support scientific research that keeps our country on the forefront of innovation. These include areas such as computer science, advanced materials, lasers, telecommunications, information technology, development of new medicines, nanotechnology, and dozens of others that hold the greatest promise of revolutionary scientific breakthroughs. These are the sectors that can create millions of new jobs and even transform society in a positive way. How do we assure hardworking American families that their tax dollars are spent only on high-priority research that is in the national interest? Well, NSF invests about $6 billion of public funds each year on research projects and related activities. Over the past 2 years, the Science Committee has reviewed numerous NSF grants, which include close examination of several dozen project files. This oversight proved useful to the committee, to the NSF, and to the public. It provided insight into the merit review process and the development of grant abstracts. The NSF peer review merit selection process is and should remain the foundation of the grant-making process. The purpose of the legislation today is to add transparency and accountability to that process. The 1950 enabling legislation, which created the NSF, set forth the Foundation's mission and cited the national interest as the foundation for public support and dissemination of basic scientific research. The Science in the National Interest Act reaffirms and restores this crucial mission. The legislation requires the NSF to explain in writing and in non-technical language how each research grant awarded supports the national interest. This will add transparency, accountability, and credibility to the NSF and its grant process, which will help the NSF earn the public's support. The bill sets forth that NSF grants should meet at least one of 7 criteria that demonstrate that a grant is in the national interest. Examples of requirements for a grant to be made include an increase in America's economic competitiveness, support of our national defense, development of an American STEM workforce, or the promotion of the progress of science for the United States. To Director Cordova's and the NSF's credit, the NSF began to implement new internal policies in January that acknowledged the need for NSF to communicate clearly and in non-technical terms the research projects it funds and how they are in the national interest. This policy parallels the requirements of this legislation. As Dr. Cordova testified before our committee earlier this year, the legislation before us and the NSF's new policies are compatible and consistent with each other. This bill establishes in law high standards that all publicly funded grants should meet. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and are focused on national priorities. Today, the NSF is able to fund just 1 out of every 5 proposals submitted by our scientists and research institutions. With a national debt that exceeds $18 trillion and continues to climb by hundreds of billions of dollars each year, we cannot fund every worthy proposal, much less frivolous ones like I could mention. The legislation before us reaffirms in law that every NSF grant must support research that is demonstrably in the national interest. This is an essential step to restore and maintain taxpayer support for basic scientific research. The bill is co-sponsored by 19 Republican and Democratic members of this committee. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I am significantly less enthusiastic about the second bill we are considering today, H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act. We've been debating this bill for 2.5 years, and we voted on versions of this bill twice before, when it was a provision in the majority's competes legislation. Sadly, this bill continues the majority's efforts to impose a layer of political review on NSF's gold standard merit review system. Chairman Smith has been clear in his own belief that many grants have successfully passed merit review are not worthy of federal funding, according to his own subjective definition of worthy. And that determination seems to be almost entirely based on how silly the title of the research grant seems to the chairman, who we all know does not claim to be a scientist, as I'm not. And I'm not here to defend the NSF grant. I lack the relevant expertise to fairly evaluate the merits or value of any particular grant. So I cannot tell you with certainty that every one of the 11,000 NSF grants awarded each year is worthy by anyone's definition. But I suspect that there can be room for debate on a few of those 11,000. However, the appropriate forum for that debate is NSF's world-renowned and much replicated merit review process, not the halls of Congress. If we do not trust the nation's scientific experts to make that judgment on whether a scientific grant is worthy of funding or not, then who do we trust? Do we trust the right-wing blogs, the Heritage Action Fund, the lawyers and businessmen and other non-scientists who populate this committee? The clear intent of this bill is to change how NSF makes funding decisions according to what Chairman Smith thinks should be or shouldn't be funded. I'm equally concerned that another perhaps unintended consequence of this bill will be to inhibit the high-risk, high-reward research at all levels. Given the chairman's love for astronomy in particular, he may be surprised that we've heard from astronomers already concerned that NSF, because of political pressure, is pushing scientists to justify everything according to a short-term return. This will necessarily reduce the ability of our agency and our scientists to conduct truly transformative research. The message this bill is sending to every single scientist applying for NSF funding, every single scientist sitting on a review panel, is don't take risk. Well, what is research if you don't take risk? Because anything you do that invites any attention from Congress will lead to significant and undeserved harassment and may even endanger your career. What we are really doing with this bill is to squash creativity, risk-taking, critical thinking, and the open exchange of ideas, the same ideas that we say are important as we talk about STEM education. I might add that the majority is pushing this agenda in the complete absence of any actual problem being identified with NSF's current policy that this bill is supposedly aligned with. If the existing policy is working, why move forward with this bill that the entire community views as politicalizing science? I am unaware of any scientific society, research university, or member of the National Science Board that has recommended what the majority is proposing, and most have expressed concerns. Yet again, the Science Committee, under our current leadership, is ignoring the scientific community we are supposedly here to support. Prior to today's markup, I made an offer of a simple 25-word change to the bill, which have made this bill palatable. That offer was unfortunately rejected by the chairman. This committee has a legitimate oversight role, And we have a responsibility to write smart legislation that strengthens the U.S. scientific enterprise while holding the funding agencies accountable. But this bill and the witch hunt for NSF grants that this committee has engaged in for 2.5 years are far from legitimate exercises. I strongly oppose the underlying bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Before I yield back, I have statements or letters from 3 scientific societies that express concerns about this bill, and I ask for those to be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I want to return, if the ranking member doesn't mind, to the one positive thing she said in her opening statement, and make sure that I understand that she may have been suggesting I'm an expert in astronomy. Is that correct?
No, I did not say that.
Oh, I thought
said
that
you love it.
I thought I heard that. Maybe not. Is there any further discussion on the bill? The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentlewoman from Maryland, I recognize the gentleman from Florida, but I think he's deferring to you.
Well, I'll yield to the gentlelady from Maryland.
Okay.
if she-
Okay, the gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized.
Are you yielding back to me? All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Scientific Research in National Interest Act, which is an effort to enhance transparency and accountability at the NSF, and would include a determination by the NSF that any grant or cooperative agreement by the NSF promotes the progress of science by being in the national interest. I think that this bill recognizes a simple fact, which is that there is such a thing as practical science. Practical science is one thing that makes us feel a certain joy serving on this committee, and a love of science. It's why we're here. We understand that science not only is beautiful in itself, but it also has the ability to solve solvable problems, expand human capabilities, and improves the lives of people. And I think that that may be one of the motivating factors behind the offering of this bill. Secondly, it's a fact that there are limited resources, and whenever you have limited resources, you have to make choices, sometimes difficult choices. So I think I understand, if I may use this term, where this bill is coming from, and that's why I support it. That being said, I want to point out that under this bill's broad definition of what's in the national interest, I would expect that most or virtually all successful grant applications at the NSF would have no difficulty in making that certification. Section 2B, 2G's promotion of the progress of science in the United States is a very broad justification for determining if research is within the national interest, and it likely covers virtually all current research being funded by the NSF and could cover all future directions that the Foundation would like to explore. Any research that advances the frontiers of knowledge and drives technological innovation promotes the progress of science for the United States. I'd also like to point out that the justifications of Section 2B2 can and should be construed both broadly and liberally. For example, Section 2B2A's inclusion of increased economic competitiveness in the United States could encompass all funding that promotes the progress of engineering, physics, chemistry, biology, and even astronomy and mathematics in order to build and strengthen our national capacity for innovation and production. Section 2B's advancement of the health and welfare of the American public certainly includes research into biology, life, the natural world, and the environment, but also behavioral and social science research would fall within the advancement of the health and well-being or welfare of the American public justification as well, because behavioral and social science builds fundamental knowledge about human behavior, interactions, and social and economic systems that underpin the health and welfare of our society. Section 2B2C's standard of development of an American STEM workforce that is globally competitive could be seen as promoting STEM education at all levels, in all settings, including both formal and informal settings, and all related research. Having a well-informed workforce that has access to the ideas and tools associated with STEM education serves to enhance the quality of life of all citizens while promoting the U.S. economic competitiveness, advancing the health and welfare of the American public, and supporting the national defense. I believe the inclusion of, especially of Section 2B2G's promotion of the progress of science in the United States likely covers virtually all current and virtually all future research engaged in by the NSF. Furthermore, I also believe that the fact that the Foundation has provided the discretion to make the determination allows the NSF itself ample room to continue its desired research without the prospect or threat of any political interference whatsoever. And I expect that for virtually all the successful grant applicants, the NSF will have no difficulty whatsoever in making this determination because these standards are supposed to be construed broadly and liberally. I want to point out that we just voted on a good example of practical science when we voted on HR 3033, the READ Act. This is an example of a situation where there's a problem in the human experience called dyslexia. We want to understand it and we want to potentially alleviate it. For 20 years, I was an officer of the Alliance for Aging Research. The reason for that is that I believed, and I believe, that aging itself is something that we can understand and ultimately alleviate. I think that this bill is simply an effort to push us in those directions of expanding science and expanding spending on science in areas where we can expand human capabilities and improve lives. And for that reason, I support it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if those standards are not interpreted broadly, though maybe not liberally, but appreciate your comments. Or is there anyone else the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized?
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I agree with the ranking member that we should oppose this bill. Now, some believe that the NSF could implement this bill without consequences, but it's important to note that the scientific community does not agree. There's significant opposition to this bill, including Dr. Holdren, the science advisor to the president, who's expressed strong reservations about this very language when he weighed in on the majority's competes bill earlier this year. And we have a number of letters in the file objecting to the bill. Now, the bill could, unfortunately, impose political judgment on the National Science Foundation's really gold standard merit review process by prohibiting NSF from funding grants for basic research unless the grant, quote, is worthy of federal funding and in the national interest. Now, everybody agrees that scientific research funded by the taxpayers should be beneficial. The NSF agrees with that, and it's important to note they have taken steps really at the urging of this committee to be more transparent, to use plain language so the public can understand the science that they are pursuing. But the concern is that to ensure that the proposals are evaluated by the science community and not by politicians. There's only one scientist on our committee, and that's Dr. Foster, who is a physicist. The rest of us care about science, that's why we're on this committee, but we are not the gold standard of review of these scientific measures. I think that the possibility of substituting a political review for the peer review process is adverse to basic science research. We are advised to avoid that by the science experts who've communicated with us. The possibility of stifling scientific innovation by discouraging scientists from pursuing high-risk, high-reward research is very present and very clear with this bill. Now, the ranking member made every effort, as she pointed out, to make small wording changes in this bill to clarify that that is not the intent of the bill, to make this bill more tolerable, and that has been rejected. I think the fact that those few words to clarify that this is not to impose political review on the science review process is very telling. With rare exceptions, every individual grant is really just making a small contribution to a much bigger scientific puzzle. And the 25 words the ranking member sought to add to the bill would have helped reassure the science community that it is the expertise and wisdom of the scientists who are going to prevail in the NSF. The fact that we could not agree on this compromise has led many to be very further concerned and suspicious about where we are going with this bill. This is not an effort I can support. I'm sure I would have agreed had the ranking member's proposed changes been adopted, and perhaps we can consider them again. But if not, I would join the ranking member in opposing this bill and urging my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. The gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized, and the gentleman from Illinois will be recognized. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I have to say, although I get the idea here, I am really dismayed that we are then going down this track of substituting things like peer review, which is, you know, a unique and a hallmark process in scientific research and evaluation for our political instincts about what works and not. And I'm really concerned about the bill and its approach to science. Many of us who come out of our science classes from when we were the youngest in elementary school knew that the idea of putting forward we learned about how you put forward a hypothesis and then you test it and then something happens that you might not expect. Back in the 1980s, a small research grant was made to a scientist named Larry Smarr. He was studying black hole collisions. And in that research, later on, the National Science Foundation said, well, in order to really make this happen, what we need to do is to develop supercomputing capacity. And it was through those small research grants that then led to the development of what we now know as our browsers onto the internet. It is absolutely true that when Larry Smarr started his research, we had no idea, none whatsoever, none that was predicted, that we would lead to our pathway, our gateway into the internet. Back in 1961, a scientist, researcher from Japan who was studying at Princeton got a little bit of money to study why jellyfish glow green. Now, you know, under the current, under this proposed legislation, many of us might have said, why do we care why jellyfish glow green? But it was through that research, started in 1961, built upon in 1988, a quarter century later, by a gentleman named Martin Chalfie, who's from Chicago, heard about the green fluorescent protein that was discovered. It was from that protein that then led another scientist several years later, Roger Sen, who was from New York. He had earned a PhD from Cambridge, and he improved on that research. And all of that, all of those improvements over time have led to a better understanding of genetics, biology, developmental biology, neurobiology, cancer, brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other diseases, and have been great use in the pharmaceutical and the biotech industries. The point is that over 3 decades, and these collective gentlemen won a Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2008. And the point is that this collective work over a period of time, not predicted in the beginning, maybe not even identified as practical, becomes research that is very practical indeed for curing diseases and for saving lives. And so I am really concerned that what we're doing here is greatly constraining all of those scientists out there who just start out with an idea and have no idea where it's going to lead. And that ends up transforming all of our lives. And I would hate to think that a group of politicians who, you know, may or may not know a lot about science, but as my colleague from California has said, we just like science and we believe in it and we believe in the investment. And yet we're going to do tremendous harm to those who actually are scientists and to the great achievements that they can make over time. And so it really does pain me as a science committee that we're doing the very thing that will undermine, absolutely undermine, the kind of transformative science that we've gotten through tiny little grants of basic research, starting in one place and not quite knowing where we will end. I always just thought that you just, you know, look at jellyfish and see the glow just because it looked pretty. I had no idea it could lead us to potential discoveries of how we can cure something as damaging as Alzheimer's. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike all except the last sentence of this bill, if that's in order.
Are you offering an amendment?
No, I'm simply, instead of striking the last word as is pro forma.
Oh, you're striking,
I'm
oh,
striking
okay.
all
I
except
missed
the
that.
last sentence.
Very good, very good. In that case, the gentleman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I have to say that I'm disappointed to see this committee spending its time reconsidering the redundant and unnecessary provisions of this bill. All of us here want to be good stewards of the taxpayer money, and the NSF is no exception. The NSF has already taken steps on their own to strengthen transparency and accountability. They implemented a new policy earlier this year to ensure that abstracts are written more clearly for public consumption and that all funded grants are consistent with the mission of the agency, as stated in the 1950 NSF Act, quote, to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. So why are we here today considering this legislation? We all claim to bemoan the loss of American scientific competitiveness, and then we turn around and consider a bill that would only add rigid and time-consuming bureaucratic requirements that stifle the exact kind of curiosity-driven research that has made us a world leader. The NSF merit review process is known as the gold standard for a reason, and the claim that this bill would somehow restore accountability and merit to this process carries with it the presupposition that the system is broken. And as a scientist who has watched the operation of the peer review and the merit review process throughout my career, I do not share this belief. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, withdraw my motion to strike all but the last sentence, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Is there any further discussion? Are there any amendments? And if not, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3293 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3293 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. No. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. With that objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 3033 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. If there is no further discussion, this completes our business. And once again, I thank the members for their interest, for their comments, and for their presence, and we stand adjourned.
Thanks for a 50% day.
What?
50% day, one day.
Remember, I'm an expert in astronomy. I'm going back to... That's pretty, you're right.